Excuse me, Professor. I believe there is an error in line 3 of your proof. The room fell into a sudden, heavy silence. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the young black woman standing in the back row. Professor Reginald Crowe did not even glance up from the board. Security lets anyone in these days, he muttered, turning slowly. Let me guess, community college. You carry the air of a long journey. Sit down before you embarrass yourself any further. A graduate student beside her quickly gathered his belongings and shifted 2 seats away. Laughter rippled from the front row. Someone raised a phone to record the moment. A whisper cut through the tension from the 3rd row. Who let her in here? Not a single person rose to her defense. Not one. Yet every person in that hall was about to witness a moment that would stay with them forever. They had underestimated her, and the reckoning was about to unfold. To truly grasp the weight of what happened next, one must understand the setting. Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts stands as one of the most influential academic institutions in the world. Within its walls was a man who carried himself as if he owned the very foundation. Professor Reginald Crowe, a tenured professor of mathematics and chair of the Department of Applied Mathematics, a fellow of the American Mathematical Society, and author of a graduate textbook, cited over 14,000 times. His grandfather had served as a Harvard dean. His father had been a Harvard professor. Reginald Crowe had not merely attended Harvard. He had inherited his place within it. Each autumn, the university hosted a distinguished lecture series in applied mathematics, named after his family. Supported by their endowment and organized under his direction, it was his domain. The series drew together exceptional graduate students, postdoctoral researchers, and visiting scholars from across the nation. On the concluding days, a public competition took place. 4 rounds of escalating difficulty challenged participants to solve problems on a whiteboard before a live audience. A panel of 3 judges evaluated each performance. After every round, those with the lowest scores were eliminated. The victor earned a public commendation from Harvard, along with a personal letter of recommendation from Professor Crowe. For many, that letter represented an advantage. For the woman in the back row, it represented everything. Her name was Amara Kingsley, a young woman born and raised in Anacostia, one of the most underserved neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. Her mother, Darlene Kingsley, had spent many years cleaning offices at Georgetown University. Resources were scarce. Some weeks there was barely enough to get by. Amara taught herself advanced mathematics not through prep schools or private tutors, but with discarded textbooks and free lecture videos from MIT viewed on a tablet with a cracked screen. She replayed those lectures countless times, until the ideas shifted from mysterious to clear. She earned a full scholarship to Howard University, graduating summa cum laude with a double major in pure mathematics and philosophy, the top student in her department. Afterward, she applied to doctoral programs at every Ivy League institution. Each one turned her away. The responses were courteous but uniform. She was not the right fit. No further explanation, just polite rejection. So, Amara took a position tutoring mathematics at a community center in D.C. She saved what she could and waited. When she learned of the Crowe Lecture Series with its open enrollment policy, allowing anyone to audit, she saw an opportunity. She bought a bus ticket to Boston and made the journey, carrying a simple backpack with a few changes of clothes. She stayed at a modest motel several miles from campus and sustained herself with basic meals from nearby stores. She had not come seeking companionship. She had come because that recommendation letter could unlock the doors that had been closed to her. From the instant she entered the hall, however, the atmosphere made one thing painfully clear. She was not welcome. It was not only Professor Crowe. It was the portraits lining the walls, all depicting white men of distinction. It was the leather seats occupied by students who addressed one another by first name with easy familiarity. It was the way eyes flicked toward her backpack, before quickly averting. A staff member at the entrance even inquired whether she had arrived for the catering setup. In the opening days, Amara sat in the back row, taking careful notes. She observed how Professor Crow interacted with different individuals. When white students posed questions, he leaned in with engagement and warmth. When a black visiting student raised a point, he hesitated, rephrased the question, and answered his own version without a smile. A graduate student named Preston Hale, seated near Amara one day, turned to his companion and remarked loudly enough for her to overhear, "I did not realize they issued auditing passes to community colleges." His friend chuckled. Amara showed no reaction. She continued writing. That evening, alone in her motel room, she reviewed the competition rules once more. 4 rounds open to all, judged on correctness, elegance, and speed. She closed her laptop and gazed at the ceiling. She had not traveled this far merely to observe from the back row. But Amara could not have known that the greatest challenge would not be entering the competition itself. It was what Professor Crow had already set in motion for anyone bold enough to challenge his authority. Professor Crow stood at the front of the lecture hall, chalk in hand, guiding the audience through an advanced proof involving graph coloring. His writing was swift and assured. Each line connected seamlessly to the next, as though he had performed this demonstration countless times. The hall remained quiet, with hundreds watching in admiration. Amara, however, was not watching with admiration. She was watching with intense concentration. Her eyes moved from the first line to the second. That seemed fine. From the second to the third, she paused. She tilted her head, consulted her notebook, then returned her gaze to the board. She checked her notes again. In the third line, Professor Crow had distributed a negative sign across a binomial expression, but had overlooked the second term. The sign should have been positive, not negative. It was a minor slip, the sort most observers would miss. Yet Amara was not most observers. She could already foresee the consequences. That single incorrect sign would alter the inequality in the 5th line, which would undermine the bound in the 8th line, rendering the entire conclusion invalid. She raised her hand. Professor Crow did not acknowledge her. He scanned the front rows, selected Bennett Shaw, his leading doctoral student seated in the 2nd row, and took his question instead. Bennett inquired about real-world applications. Professor Crow smiled and responded with genuine warmth. They exchanged thoughts like colleagues of long standing. Amara's hand remained raised. Eventually, Professor Crow glanced toward the rear of the room. His smile faded. Yes, the auditor. Not her name, not Miss, not even you in the back. Simply the auditor, a label rather than a person. Amara began to speak. "Professor, in the 3rd line of your proof." He held up one finger and interrupted. "I will take questions from enrolled participants first. If time remains at the end, auditors may submit questions in writing." He turned back to the board. The matter was closed. The hall grew quiet, but it was not a silence born of respect or sympathy. It was the silence of discomfort. A few students in the front exchanged uneasy glances. Preston Hale smirked. Someone in the middle section whispered, "She actually believed she could speak up." Lila Monroe, a black woman seated beside Amara, another auditing visitor, clutched her armrest tightly, her knuckles paling. She looked at Amara with an expression that pleaded, "Let it go. It is not worth it." But Amara did not let it go. She looked at the board. She looked at the man who had just reduced her to a category. She looked at the hundreds of people who had already concluded she had nothing of value to contribute. And she raised her hand once more. This time, the room took notice. Not out of support, but out of curiosity. The kind of curiosity that arises when someone approaches the edge of a precipice. Bennett turned in his seat. Conversation ceased. Even Preston looked back. Professor Crow saw the raised hand. He understood that the room was watching. Ignoring her again would appear petty. Allowing her to speak might lead her to expose her own limitations, which would validate his stance. He sighed, the sigh of a man extending a courtesy that was undeserved. "Fine. Go ahead." Amara rose. She did not hurry. She did not falter. She looked straight at the board and spoke in a voice that was calm, clear, and unwavering. "In line 3, when you distributed the negative sign across the binomial, the second term should be positive, not negative." She paused, not for effect, but to give everyone time to examine the board. "That changes the inequality in line 5, which means the bound you stated in line 8 does not hold." Then she sat down. That was all. 3 sentences. No elaboration, no apology, no qualification. She had simply stated what she observed and resumed her seat. The room did not react at once. A profound silence settled. Not polite, not respectful, but the silence of hundreds of minds simultaneously performing the calculation. Every head turned toward the board. Eyes traced line 3. Fingers followed the negative sign. Lips moved in silent recalculation. Gradually, the realization spread through the room like a wave. She was correct. The sign was wrong. The inequality in line 5 collapsed. The bound in line 8 was invalid. The entire conclusion that a tenured Harvard professor had presented with complete confidence rested upon an error that a young woman from Anacostia had identified in mere moments. It took the room several seconds to reach that understanding. It took Professor Crow even less. He knew before anyone else. One could see it in the way his hand froze mid-motion. One could see it in the subtle tightening of his jaw before he turned. Yet Reginald Crow had spent decades in academia and had learned how to shield himself. He faced the room and smiled, a smile that required considerable effort. "An interesting observation," he said. "The sign is indeed reversed. However, this does not materially affect the conclusion of the proof." That was untrue, and every person in the room with graduate-level training recognized it as such. The sign error did not merely influence the conclusion. It invalidated it entirely. Professor Crow was relying on the weight of his reputation to outweigh the mathematics. For decades, that wager had succeeded. But this time, something felt different. A postdoctoral researcher in the front row, a woman named Dr. Helena Voss, opened her notebook and began re-examining the proof from the beginning. Then a student 2 rows behind her did the same. Then Bennett Shaw, Professor Crow's own protege, took out a pen and started working through the derivation. The quiet verification itself served as judgment. No one spoke. No one needed to. The sound of pens moving across paper conveyed everything. Professor Crow watched it unfold. He stood at the front and observed his own students confirming that he had been mistaken and that the woman he had just dismissed was correct. The narrator noted that he did not lose the room in that instant, but for the first time in his career, he sensed it beginning to shift. At the panel table, something else was occurring. Dr. Helena Voss, visiting professor from Princeton, one of the leading number theorists in the country, and one of the few black women to hold a named chair at a top research university, tilted her head slightly. She looked at the board. She looked at Amara. She opened her notebook and wrote 2 words. "Check her." She said nothing aloud. She did not need to. She had seen enough. During the break, Lila grabbed Amara's arm in the hallway. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Amara met her gaze. "I pointed out a sign error." Lila stared at her. "You just pointed out a sign error to a man who named a lecture series after himself, in his own building, in front of his own students, in front of hundreds of people." Amara's expression remained steady, but something changed in her eyes. Not triumph. Something quieter, a dawning realization. Perhaps the door had never been as firmly locked as she had believed. The break ended. Students returned to the hall. The atmosphere had shifted subtly, yet unmistakably. People who had previously ignored Amara now glanced in her direction. Not with warmth, not yet, but with curiosity, the kind that emerges when one realizes they may have misjudged someone. Then, Professor Crow made his announcement. In the spirit of open scholarship, he declared, the upcoming public competition would be expanded. All participants, including auditing guests, were welcome to register. He looked directly at Amara as he spoke, offering a warm, generous smile, the sort a man gives when he believes he is setting a trap. After all, he added, if our auditing guest possesses such a sharp eye for errors, I am certain she will find the competition quite stimulating. A few students laughed. Preston Hale grinned. But Amara did not laugh. She did not grin. She returned Professor Crow's gaze with an expression that revealed nothing. She nodded once. She was in, and she had no idea, not yet, that the contest had already been arranged to disadvantage her before it even began. The lecture hall had been reconfigured for the competition. The chairs were arranged accordingly. The panel of 3 judges sat at a long table at the front. A large whiteboard occupied the center of the stage. The first rows were reserved for the official participants. The remaining seats were filled with spectators. Every seat was occupied. Some stood along the back wall. Amara sat in the front row for the first time. She was the only participant without a formal invitation, the only auditor, the only Howard graduate, the only one carrying a backpack rather than a leather portfolio. 12 competitors. 11 of them had been personally selected by Professor Crow. The 12th had been challenged to appear. The rules were straightforward. In each round, a problem would be presented on the board. Participants had a set period to solve it and then present their solution. The panel scored based on 3 criteria: correctness, elegance, and speed. The lowest scorers were eliminated after each round. The final round would be one-on-one. In the opening round, an optimization problem appeared, a variant of what mathematicians refer to as the assignment problem, a scheduling challenge involving the most efficient matching of tasks to resources. The other participants began setting up the standard approach, known as the Hungarian method, a well-established algorithm taught in graduate programs everywhere. Bennett Shaw moved quickly and confidently. He knew the technique thoroughly. Amara studied the problem for a short while. She did not begin writing immediately. She simply observed. Then she noticed something no one else had seen. The problem possessed a hidden symmetry. The graph structure was bipartite, meaning it could be divided into 2 groups, with connections only between them, not within. That symmetry allowed the entire problem to be reframed.
Gió đưa
Instead of
là
applying the standard
mãi đi theo những chặng đường con qua, anh chẳng ngà nhuộm từng câu hát. Hỡi người đừng vội sang ngang, bên sông còn đò.
Bennett finished second. His answer was correct, but his approach had taken the longer route. He had constructed a highway. Amara had discovered a shortcut no one else had recognized. The panel awarded scores. Amara received the highest marks. Bennett came in second. Professor Crow, seated in the audience, did not applaud. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and the room began to change. Students who had smirked at Amara days earlier were now leaning forward. A few took out their phones, not to mock her this time, but to record her. Someone in the back posted on social media, "An auditor from Howard is leading the Crow Challenge at Harvard. You need to see this." The post spread quickly through academic networks. Comments followed. "She really just walked into Harvard with a backpack and a self-taught education, and she's outperforming everyone. No one says anything because the math speaks for itself, and they're still looking at her like she's nothing. That's wild." Between rounds, developments occurred behind the scenes. Professor Crow approached the panel during the break and suggested that the remaining problems should increase in theoretical depth. It sounded reasonable. It was not. It was a signal to shift the problems toward areas requiring familiarity with cutting-edge research, the kind shared in exclusive Harvard seminars, the kind a student from Howard would not have encountered. Dr. Helena Voss noticed. She did not object immediately, but she observed and began maintaining a careful record. Meanwhile, Amara sat in the hallway, eating a granola bar from her backpack. She had no idea what was being discussed. She had no idea the rules were being quietly adjusted against her. She was simply reviewing her notes and attempting to steady her trembling hands. Not from fear, but from the immense effort of being the only person in the room no one had expected to be there. Leela found her in the hallway and sat beside her. For a while she said nothing. Then she spoke. "You know they are going to come for you, right?" Amara looked at her. "I know. And you are still going to do this." "I did not come all this way to quit after the first round." Lila nearly smiled. But the next round would not be a standard textbook problem, and the scoring would not be entirely as it appeared. Because, while Amara was eating in the hallway, Professor Crow was in another room, ensuring that the game she was winning would become one she could not win. In the second round, the problem appeared on the board. Prove the following statement. Below it was a mathematical claim regarding a specific property of connected graphs. It appeared straightforward. Every participant picked up their chalk and began constructing a proof. Bennett wrote rapidly. Two other doctoral candidates worked through careful, methodical steps. The room was quiet except for the sound of chalk on boards. Amara did not pick up her chalk. She stood before the board and stared at the statement. Time passed. People in the audience began to whisper. Preston Hale leaned toward the person beside him and said, "Looks like she finally hit her ceiling." But Amara was not stuck. She was thinking. And what she was thinking was something no one else in the room had considered. The statement was false. Everyone else was attempting to prove something that could not be proved. They were building paths to a destination that did not exist. Amara saw it. She saw that if one constructed a small graph, just 6 vertices connected in a particular pattern, the entire claim would collapse. She picked up the chalk. She drew the graph. 6 dots connected in a specific way. She stepped back and spoke 5 words. "This is a counterexample. The statement is false." The panel conferred. Dr. Helena Voss examined the graph closely. She verified each connection. She nodded. The statement was indeed false. 3 participants were eliminated immediately. They had spent their entire time trying to prove something that was never true. Amara advanced. The scores were announced. Amara received a 91. She frowned slightly but said nothing. She had no way of knowing that the score recorded on the panel's original sheet had been 98. Someone had altered it between the scoring table and the announcement. 7 points had been taken from her. We will return to this. In the third round, the clock began. The problem required finding the maximum independent set in a specific class of graphs. In simple terms, given a network of connected points, identify the largest group of points where no two are directly connected to each other. The time available was brief. For this type of problem, it was almost nothing. The other participants dove in at once, working step by step. Bennett moved quickly. His pen advanced with precision. He built the answer from the ground up, testing combinations and eliminating options. Amara did something different. She looked at the graph and drew its complement. A mirror image in which every connection became a gap, and every gap became a connection. This transformed the independent set problem into a clique problem. Finding the largest group of unconnected points in the original graph became finding the largest group of fully connected points in the new graph. And the new graph was far simpler. She identified the clique visually. She wrote down the answer. She set the chalk down with time still remaining on the clock. Bennett finished just before the end. His answer was correct, but Amara had finished well ahead of him. 2 more participants were eliminated. The field was reduced to 4. Amara, Bennett, and 2 other doctoral candidates who were beginning to appear quite uneasy. The semi-final pairings were announced, supposedly at random. Amara versus Bennett. The 2 doctoral candidates against each other. If one believes that pairing was truly random, One has not been following this story closely. That evening, the story began to spread. The post from the first round had circulated widely in academic circles. A mathematics blog published a brief article headlined, "Who is Amara Kingsley?" Someone located her Howard University transcript and shared it online. A journalist from the Boston Globe contacted Harvard's press office requesting comment. The story was no longer solely about a competition. It concerned a system, and people were paying attention. Back at her motel, several miles from campus, Amara sat on the edge of the bed, beneath a single lamp. A simple meal sat half-eaten on the nightstand. Her notebook lay open in her lap. She was reviewing graph theory problems, writing solutions in handwriting so small it scarcely fit on the page. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from exhaustion, from the burden of spending days in a room that punished her for simply existing, from smiling through insults, from pretending she did not hear the whispers, from solving problems at the highest level, while bearing an invisible weight that no one else in that competition had to carry. There was a knock at the door. It was Lila. She entered and sat on the only chair in the room. She looked at Amara's hands. She looked at the meal. She looked at the notebook. She did not speak for a long time. Then she said, "You do not have to prove anything to them." Amara did not look up. "I am not proving anything to them." "Then who?" Amara stopped writing. She stared at the wall for a moment. Then she said, "Every girl in Anacostia who thinks this door is locked." Lila did not respond. There was nothing to add to that. It was the truest statement either of them had spoken all week. The next morning, Amara returned to the lecture hall. The semi-final would take place soon. The room was already alive with anticipation. More people had arrived than the previous day. Word had spread. A few new faces appeared in the crowd. One belonged to a journalist with a notebook. Bennett Shaw sat in the front row reviewing notes. He looked relaxed, confident. He had every reason to be. He had spent years studying under Professor Crow. He had access to research papers, seminar materials, and techniques unavailable to anyone outside Harvard's inner circle. Amara had a backpack and a cracked tablet, but she also possessed something Bennett did not. She had spent years alone with numbers. Not in a classroom, not with a tutor, not with a professor guiding her through the difficult sections. Alone in a room with a single lamp. And in those years, she had learned something no seminar could teach. She had learned to perceive the shape of problems she had never encountered before. She sat down. She opened her notebook. She waited. She had solved 11 problems in succession. But the 12th was different. The 12th had been designed to defeat her. The semi-final problem appeared on the board. Amara looked at it. Bennett looked at it. The room looked at it. Bennett smiled. Amara did not. The problem involved proving a tight bound on a specific connectivity property in random networks. It was advanced, it was elegant, and it was not from any textbook, any published paper, or an publicly available source. It came from Professor Crow's own unpublished research. The technique required to solve it had only ever been taught in one place. Professor Crow's private advanced seminar, which ran once a year and was open only to his hand-picked doctoral students. Bennett Shaw had taken that seminar. He had studied that technique. He had practiced it. He recognized the problem, the way one recognizes a familiar melody. Amara Kingsley had never seen it. She had never been invited to the seminar. She had never had access to the research. She was facing a problem, specifically chosen to ensure her defeat. The field had been tilted, not through an obvious rule change, not through anything one could easily point to and call cheating, but through problem selection, the most subtle form of rigging, the kind that appears fair on the surface and is corrupt beneath. And there was something else, something Amara would not discover until after everything had concluded. Her score in the second round had been altered. Her actual score, the one written on the panel's original scoring sheet, had been 98. The score announced to the room had been 91. 7 points had been taken from her. If the true score had stood, Amara would have entered the semi-final with a commanding lead. Instead, she entered believing she was barely ahead. 2 manipulations, 2 invisible barriers, both constructed by the same man. At the panel table, Dr. Helena Voss read the problem, and her expression changed. She recognized it immediately. She had reviewed Professor Crow's unpublished draft months earlier as part of a peer consultation. She knew precisely where this problem originated, and she knew exactly what it signified. She wrote a note on her pad and slid it to the panelists beside her. It read, "This is from his draft. I need the original scoring sheets from round 2. The panelist read the note. He looked at Dr. Voss. She did not look back. She was watching the board. The clock started. Bennett picked up his chalk with the confidence of a man who already knew the answer. Amara picked up hers with the focus of a woman who knew she was walking into a trap. But she picked it up anyway. Bennett moved like a man taking a test for which he had already seen the answers. His chalk glided across the board in smooth, assured strokes. Every line followed the next without hesitation. He was not solving the problem. He was performing the solution. The technique from Professor Crow's seminar fit the problem perfectly. The room watched him with quiet admiration. Partway through, he was well advanced. Amara was further behind. She was working from first principles. No shortcut, no memorized technique. She was constructing the solution from the ground up, using only the tools she had brought with her, the ones she had taught herself in motel rooms, community centers, and a bedroom in Anacostia, with one lamp and a cracked tablet. It was not fast enough. Bennett was nearly finished. Amara was only halfway. The gap was visible. The audience could see it. Whispering began. "She's falling behind." She had a good run. This was always going to happen. Preston Hale leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He looked satisfied. Professor Crow sat in the audience with his hands folded. His expression was calm and patient, the expression of a man watching a trap function exactly as intended. Then, Amara made a mistake. She transposed 2 indices in her derivation. A small error, the kind that occurs when the mind moves faster than the hand. She caught it almost at once, but the correction cost her valuable time. Time she did not have. With little time remaining, Bennett was nearly done. Amara was staring at a board full of unfinished work. And then something occurred that had not happened at any point in this story. Amara stopped writing. Her chalk hand lowered slightly. Her shoulders shifted. Her breathing changed. For a few seconds, she looked like a woman who was about to set the chalk down and walk away from the board. Hundreds of people saw it. Some felt sympathy. Some felt vindicated. Preston Hale almost laughed. Lila Monroe, seated in the audience, was gripping the armrest so tightly, her knuckles had gone white. She was not breathing. Then Amara looked up. Not at the board. Not at Bennett. Not at Professor Crow. She looked at the audience. And somewhere in the crowd, her eyes found Lila. Lila did not nod. She did not smile. She did not mouth words of encouragement. She simply looked at Amara. Steady, unblinking, without pity, without fear. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply refuse to look away. Amara turned back to the board. She stared at her work for a moment. Then she did something no one expected. She erased 3 lines. Not a correction, not a fix. She wiped out an entire section of her approach and started over. She abandoned the standard path completely. She was not going to chase Bennett's technique. She was not going to play the game Professor Crow had designed for her to lose. She was going to build her own. A new construction appeared on the board. An auxiliary graph. A mapping between 2 structures that no one in the room had seen before. She was not following any textbook. She was not applying any known method. She was inventing something in real time, under pressure, with hundreds of people watching and time running out. Bennett set his chalk down. Done. The room applauded. His solution was clean, correct, and built upon the technique he had been given. Professor Crow nodded in approval. With seconds remaining, Amara was still writing. Her chalk moved rapidly, faster than it had all day. New lines, new inequalities, the auxiliary graph was taking form. She was running out of space. She moved to a corner of the board and wrote the final line, small but clear, the line that completed the proof. The buzzer sounded, but Dr. Helena Voss had been watching the entire board from the panel table, and she had noticed something everyone else had missed. Amara stepped back from the board. The buzzer was still echoing. Professor Crow stood and walked to the front of the room with a slow, measured stride, the stride of a man who had already decided the outcome. He positioned himself directly in front of the whiteboard, directly in front of the corner where Amara had written her final line, and faced the audience. "Time," he said. "Mr. Shaw has completed his solution. Unfortunately, Miss Kingsley's work appears to be incomplete." He gestured toward the board behind him. From the audience's perspective, the main body of Amara's proof was visible. The auxiliary graph, the mapping, the inequalities, but the final line, the one she had written in the corner in the last moments, was hidden behind Professor Crow's body. The room saw an unfinished board. Bennett was awarded the round. The audience clapped, polite, restrained, the kind of applause that says, "Well, that settles it." Amara stood at the side of the stage, silent and still. Her face revealed nothing. Leela, in the audience, had tears running down her face. Not because it was sad, but because it was unfair. Because everyone in the room had just witnessed a rigged game produce exactly the result it was designed to produce. Bennett shook hands with two of the panelists. Professor Crow was already preparing to announce the final round format. The story, it seemed, had ended. Every person in that room believed it was over. Then, Dr. Helena Voss spoke. "Professor Crow." Her voice was not loud. She did not raise it. She did not need to. It was the kind of voice that halts a room, not because of its volume, but because of its authority. Decades at Princeton, hundreds of published papers, a named chair in number theory. When Helena Voss said your name, you stopped what you were doing. Professor Crow stopped. "Before you proceed," Dr. Voss said, "I would like to examine Miss Kingsley's board." Professor Crow blinked. "The solution is incomplete, Dr. Voss. We all saw it." "Humor me." 2 words. The room went silent. Not the uncomfortable silence from before. A different kind. The kind in which hundreds of people suddenly realized they might be about to witness something unexpected. Dr. Voss stood. She pushed her chair back. She walked from the panel table to the whiteboard. Every eye in the room followed her. Professor Crow had no choice. A Princeton professor, a fellow of the American Mathematical Society, had made a public request to examine a contestant's work. Refusing would be an admission that he had something to hide. He stepped aside, and when he moved, the corner of the board became visible. Dr. Voss began at the first line. She traced Amara's proof with her finger. The auxiliary graph construction, the bijection, the one-to-one mapping between edge sets in the original problem, and vertex covers in the new structure. The probabilistic counting argument. Each step built upon the last, clean, logical, original. Her finger reached the end of the main body of work. She continued. It moved to the corner. She stopped. She read the final line. She read it again. Then she turned to face the room. A moment of silence followed. In that moment, hundreds of people were confused. Bennett was frowning. Professor Crow's smile was frozen in place, like a mask that no longer fit. Lila had stopped breathing. Amara had not moved. Then Dr. Voss spoke. "The proof is complete." She pointed to the corner. "The final line is here, written in the last seconds before the clock expired." She paused. She looked at the board once more. Then she said, "The bound is tight, the bijection is original, and it is without question the most elegant proof presented in this competition." For one more moment, the room remained still. One more moment of hundreds of people processing what they had just heard. One more moment of recalculating everything they thought they knew. Then the room erupted. It did not begin with applause. It began with a gasp from someone in the third row, then a murmur that rippled outward like a stone, dropped into water, then clapping. Not the polite kind from before, the real kind, the kind that starts in one place and spreads until it fills the entire space. Students stood. The postdoctoral researcher in the front row covered her mouth with both hands. Two professors on the panel began clapping before the third had fully processed what had occurred. Lila was sobbing, not quietly. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep, from a place where every insult, every dismissal, every closed door had been stored and compressed and was now releasing all at once. Bennett Shaw stared at the corner of the board for a long time. Then he turned to Amara. He did not look angry. He did not look resentful. He looked like a man who had just watched someone accomplish something he could not have done. He began clapping. He was the first person standing in his row. Professor Crow did not clap. He did not stand. He remained at the side of the stage, looking at the corner of the board. The corner he had been standing in front of. The corner he had blocked when he declared her solution incomplete. Whether he knew the final line was there is a question only he can answer. But hundreds of people saw where he had been standing, and hundreds of people would remember. Amara did not celebrate. She did not pump her fist. She did not cry. She closed her eyes for a brief moment. When she opened them, she looked at the board, not at the audience, not at Professor Crow, not at the cameras. She looked at her own work, because the proof was the only thing in that room that had never lied to her. Dr. Voss turned to the panel. I move that we reevaluate the semi-final scores. Miss Kingsley's proof is not only complete, it is superior. The bijection is original. The approach is more general than the standard method. I further move that the competition be awarded outright. There is nothing a final round could add. The panel voted unanimously in favor. Amara Kingsley won the Crow Challenge. Bennett shook her hand. That bijection was something I have never seen. Where did that come from? Amara looked at him. I did not have your technique, so I had to build my own path. Bennett paused, then said quietly, your path was better. The room was still applauding, but the story was not over, because Dr. Voss was not finished. She had one more thing to say, and when she said it, the applause would stop, and the silence that followed would be the loudest sound that room had ever heard. The applause was still fading when Dr. Voss stood again. No one had left. Hundreds of people remained, phones still out, some still recording. She walked to the center of the stage carrying two documents. Before we conclude, there is a matter of record. The room grew quiet. She held up the first document. The semi-final problem was traced to an unpublished research draft authored by Professor Crow months ago. The technique required to solve it was taught exclusively in his private seminar, available only to his doctoral students. She held up the second document. This is the original scoring sheet from the second round. Miss Kingsley's actual score was 98. The score announced to this room was 91. She placed both documents on the table. The discrepancy has been documented. Hundreds of heads turned toward Professor Crow. Then the phones came up. Not a few. Many. Red recording lights blinked across the auditorium like unblinking eyes. Dean Franklin Holt stood from his seat. He saw the phones. He saw the journalist from the Boston Globe scribbling notes. The Crow lecture series is suspended immediately pending review by the Office of Academic Integrity. Professor Crow, you are relieved of all administrative duties, including department chair, effective now. He paused. Additionally, I believe an acknowledgement is owed to Miss Kingsley, Professor Crow. Every camera pointed at one man. Professor Crow stood. His face was ashen. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Miss Kingsley, I owe you an apology. The competition should have been conducted fairly. It was not. That is my responsibility. The words emerged as though being extracted with difficulty, but they were public. They were recorded. They could never be unsaid. Shortly after, The video had millions of views. By the next day, the story appeared on the front pages of the Boston Globe, the New York Times, and CNN. 3 former students came forward with similar accounts. His publisher paused his textbook. Speaking invitations disappeared. Decades of prestige collapsed within days. Harvard does not fire tenured professors. It allows them to become invisible. In the days that followed, the lecture hall stood empty. Amara returned to collect a notebook she had left behind. The room was silent. The seats were empty. The lights were dim. But the whiteboard was still there, and her proof was still on it. No one had erased it. She was not alone. Professor Crow was standing in front of the board. Not performing, not lecturing, simply standing there looking at her work. His career lay in ruins. His name had been removed from the series his family had built. His office had been reassigned. But none of that was on his face in that moment. He was simply looking at the mathematics. He heard her footsteps and turned. "Miss Kingsley, the bijection. Where did you learn that technique?" "I did not learn it, I built it." A long pause. The longest silence between 2 people in this entire story. No cameras, no audience, no performance. Just a man and a woman and a proof on a board. It was not an apology. The apology had already been given publicly, in front of cameras, and it had meant little. This was different. This was a man standing alone in front of a proof he could not have written, admitting to himself as much as to her that he had been wrong about her. Amara received the letter of recommendation, reviewed by committee. She applied to 3 doctoral programs and was accepted to all 3. She chose MIT, not Harvard. She did not choose the institution that had finally allowed her entry. She chose the one that had wanted her from the beginning. On the bus ride home to Washington, D.C., she called Lila. "How does it feel?" Amara thought for a moment. "It feels like the door was never locked. We just could not see the handle." This story resonates because Amara did not argue or plead. She simply arrived and allowed her work to speak. And the man who attempted to erase her found himself revealed instead. That is the nature of truth. You can try to obstruct it, but you cannot stop it. If this story reminds you of someone whose talent the world has not yet seen, share it with them. And if you wish to hear more stories like this, stay with us, because Amara Kingsley is not the last. She is only the beginning.